Hello, fellow Swoop players here, and anybody else that might be tuning in. If you're wondering who I am, my name is Cole Myers. I'm part of the Raleigh Raiders competitive team here that plays the wonderful game of Star Wars Unlimited in Raleigh, North Carolina. Home shop is Triangle Area Trading Cards. Shout out. Wonderful place to stop in and talk to anybody you want, and shop owners are great, and everything about the store is great. I had to give them a shout out because they've been supporting us, and we've been supporting them too. So it's a nice little community we got going here. But wanted to get some more YouTube content out today. Follow up the heels of my guy Tommy, Mr. Tico himself, Sabine Wizard, and talk about one of my favorite decks, one of my favorite characters in all of Star Wars, Cad Bane, and kind of talk through kind of his swan song, if you will, with him rotating out here soon, and why I think he's probably primed to maybe be the most competitive he's ever been, even though he's definitely won PQs and done very well at other events in the past. So some of the table of contents here, we're going to talk about Cad Bane and why now. He's not a new leader by any means, right? He's been around since set 2, so he's been around for some time. I definitely wanted to touch on the anatomy and the origins of kind of the Weenie Cad Bane deck that we've been seeing around. Talk about some of the core cards of any Cad Bane deck, whether it's the Weenie version or the mid-range version that I've grown to know more so. And some color choices. I don't think there's just a Tarkentown build out there that you have to play by. I think there's definitely room for a blue variant. I've played a Data Vault kind of green style as well, because there's some top end cards in there that are ambushers and have underworld traits to them as well. Excuse me. Talk about some flex and fringe cards that I think can be fine additions to any sort of Cad Bane deck, depending on your local meta or how you like to play it. And then finally going to wrap up with some new Secrets of Power additions that I think also really help this leader maybe push into the most competitive he's ever been. So a very quick overview. Like I said, this isn't a leader that's new to anybody, but and obviously we have to use the showcase here to really properly show him off. But anytime you play an underworld card, anytime it's got that trait that's of the underworld, you can exhaust him and your opponent chooses to do a damage to it. And then on the flip side, obviously the 2/8 with the raid 2, so he can hit a lot harder than he defends, and then you get 2 damage when you play an underworld card. So ideally you want to be maximizing this on the flip, playing 2 cards at once. And in kind of the meta that we have grown accustomed to, playing 2 cards on one turn may not have been the most ideal way to play the game in the past, especially in a deck like this that doesn't necessarily have the most card draw. But with some of the decisions that have been made, notably with Force Throw, it's, again, I think, primed to be the most competitive it's ever been, because this is a leader that has a deck that is oriented around not as much card draw and playing 2 cards per turn, sometimes 3 cards per turn. And then if you're doing that and getting cards discarded from your hand, you're often left with not a lot of options at that point. So ideally you want to be playing a deck that is primarily underworld focused, obviously, and playing around maximizing this ping ability and kind of not really giving your opponent agency and choices on how to target it. And that's how that Tarkentown that you most normally see comes into play, and that's where the ambushers come into play too. Being able to have your opponent with 1 unit on the board and the damage specifically goes to that unit versus them being able to choose where that goes. So you really want to be narrowing your opponent's board. You don't want to really be letting them go wide. Anytime they get multiple units out, it becomes a lot harder and his ability becomes a lot worse. So why now? Definitely been touching on it, but with the removal of Force Throw and then kind of twofold with the removal of Quinlan. I say removal of Quinlan. I still think the deck is going to be fairly decent, but anytime you lose the best card out of a deck, it's probably going to get worse. And this is a matchup that I can speak from experience is not the most Cad favored. I'm not going to say it's impossible by any means, but having played against a lot of experienced Quinlan players, a lot of Quinlan players that have topped PQs and done very well at other notable events, it's not a very fun matchup. So with that that deck definitely on the decline, and Force Throw itself being gone, not having to worry about, resourcing maybe some higher costed units because you gotta hold on to a 1 cost or a 2 cost to mitigate that damage. It's not something that you have to really worry about anymore, and you can freely play on that cat turn by playing 1 or 2 cards, and maybe sometimes 3 cards on that flip to really maximize that damage. So it's not just Quinlan, right? But just not having to worry about losing your hand and being able to really play the game. So that's something that we're talking about now, because again, I think without the Force Throw and with one of the, I wouldn't say worse matchups, I think Control's probably a little bit harder, but with one of these other mid-range decks kind of taking down or going down in popularity, I think that this is probably the best ping deck now, the best Tarkentown deck, and I think that there's definitely some tools that are out there and some tools that are potentially on the way that really help shore up that Control matchup too. So that's mostly why we're talking about this now, a leader that's been around for some time. So before we get into kind of some of the stuff that you're grown accustomed to, and maybe you guys have grown accustomed to this as well, but this Cad Weenie anatomy and the origins of it, I think the origins definitely are because of the Quinlan matchup. You get into that pass battle, and sometimes it's right, sometimes it's wrong. You pass long enough, then they just Kira and really take away whatever you want to do, and then you just kind of fall apart from there. But it's not really an issue anymore. But this is kind of where I think the anatomy and the origins of it came from, is because if they pass, you can just play one of these 1-drops and then play another card and get that ping off. They can't ping your guy because they're not often playing 1-drops. Most decks really aren't often playing 1-drops, so it's more of an aggro variant, I would say. I think Criminal Muscle is a pretty damn solid card. Being able to ping off shields on like Secretive Sage, for instance, and then getting that ping with another 1-drop to Tarkentown to keep your opponent off of the force, I think is pretty solid play. And then you just have 2 bodies on board, some stats, things that you can put this Darth Maul's lightsaber on, the hot shots, the surprise strikes, things of that nature. And Smuggle's always a kind of a get out of jail free card if you need it, if you're trying to push damage at the very end there. But I think the Darth Maul's lightsaber is definitely holding for the Cad Bane flip. That's a ton of stats on a leader that's already got a ton of stats. Swinging for 8, and then also having 10 health is pretty decent. So, well, I think this variant can definitely still stay around. I definitely think it was more so catered and geared to dealing with that Quinlan matchup, because it lined up with its early play lines a lot better than some of the other decks out there. But yeah, we'll see what happens to the Weenie deck going forward. I think the mid-range deck is pretty much the exact same outside of all of these early plays. I mean, obviously that changes things a lot, but the mid-range definitely relies more on the Bazines, maybe the Crafties, some Cartel Spacers, things like that, to get some more stats on board and do some different things. So let's talk about the core here. These are probably the 8 cards that you're probably going to mostly find in Cad Bane, regardless of the color, which is another reason why I think the color or the aspect of the leader's base is important as well, because as you see here, even though Hotshot is a aggression aspect, it's predominantly played because of the smuggling, which is cunning, the color of all of the rest of these cards and the color of the leader itself. So that's why I think that you can definitely play it in a lot of different colors here, but these are the main colors you'll see here. Hotshot straightforward. You suit up your Cad Bane leader with it. He's swinging for 6. You can wipe things off the board with pings. Just a very strong play, and kind of goes back to that 2-card combo. Definitely a better play when Force Throw was around, because you didn't have to really worry about getting your hand stripped as much as it was coming from the row. Greedo is pretty self-explanatory. 1 cost 3/1. I mean, that's a ton of power on a 1-cost leader. The Underworld ping. You can play him, McClunky him back in that 1 turn if you want to. Not my favorite play line, because it's just kind of a stall tactic and a deck that doesn't really like to go too terribly late. But that's something that you can do with those 2 1-drop cards. Again, something that we can more freely do now that we don't have to worry about getting our hands stripped. The When Defeated is obviously a bit of a gamble. You can tailor your deck to get it to go off more often, obviously. That's when that hits, that can be really, really pivotal. Killing a 5-drop, or a 5 health leader with, a 1-costed unit. Aura Sing is a pretty clear addition to the list. I think most Cads, Weenie or not, are going to be playing this card. I mean, it's just great stats, great abilities, that Underworld ping too. Obviously, its defense is not the best, but Raid 2 for a 2-cost and hidden as well, it's almost always going to be attacking that next turn regardless. Old Faithful here is Boba Fett. Obviously, the on-attack is not as great as it used to be before they told us that we can't nuke Sabines right when they flip. But that on-attack still does come into play fairly frequently. And obviously 3-5 is kind of that premier stat line for any 3-cost unit. McClunky is a very, very good card. Now that Forcer is gone, we got to have something to complain about, so maybe that will be McClunky going forward. You got to notice that you have to do the 3 damage first and then the Cad ping if you're going to do it, because it is an Underworld card, which makes it that much stronger in this deck and pretty much only playable in this deck, I would say. Or not only playable, you do see it in some PAL versions and things like that, but it is a must-have in this deck with all of the Underworld cards that you do have. And I would say that Mist Hunter is also a core card. The card draw is the only way that we're getting card draw in this deck, really. Obviously, the on-attack is not the best, ability for it. On-attacks can sometimes be hit or miss or a little too slow, depending, especially on something that's got a 4 health line here. But at the end of the day, 3-4 in space isn't terrible. And Underworld trait, which we gotta have it. And drawing cards is always great. We love drawing cards. And then the last 2 are pretty self-explanatory. I mean, these guys are just stats on a stick. The first one can ambush, take out typically something in conjunction with Tarkin Town that has 5 health, because your opponent's typically playing from behind at that point, trying to claw back board, and that ping plus the ambush can really continue, putting that foot to the pedal. And then you just have Zuckuss to come over the top, giving, the 4-LOM and the Zuckuss both +1/+1. Saboteur and ambush, which is just ludicrous, honestly, if you can keep that play line going, and that's a ton of stats. I mean, Zuckuss too with the Saboteur can really just kind of win that Kylo Tarkin Town matchup a lot of the times too, where you don't really even have to worry about Kylo sometimes when he flips, because you're just hot-shotting or surprise striking a Zuckuss for 8 or 9 to base, and it's just oftentimes too late with that Saboteur ability. You don't have to worry about turrets, any Sentinel, a lot of the shield stuff that you'll see too. Zuckuss is just a great card. Sometimes you just hard cast it even without the 4-LOM, but obviously with the 4-LOM it's very, very good. So I would consider these 8 kind of the core. I mean, obviously there's a lot of other cards that you'll predominantly see with the Cad Bane deck, but these are the ones that you'll see in the Weenie version, the mid-range version, really any aspect color version. So just touching on this, the color choices, I thought we only saw with Tarkin Town. I think you're definitely not only, but you're more often than not going to be seeing it with Tarkin Town. But I think there is some viability to these other choices. I mean, Long Pike, Pike Sentinel, Power of the Dark Side, obviously not an Underworld card, but those are all very, very good cards. The first 2 I mentioned have an Underworld trait. Snoke is something that you often see at the very end. Obviously, you can get really high if you want to with Avengers and things of that nature. I think there's Anakin lines in there too. You have -3/-3 on top of pings if you wanted to do that. Especially if you're kind of running that bamboozle type package, you get that -6/-6 on top of a ping can be really, really good on a Cad Bane flip. So I think there's a lot in blue, and then we'll get to it later. But plotting out the new Cad Bane unit with the immediate ping of the Underworld, and then kind of doing that immediate kill too, or something with 2 or less health, can be potentially very, very strong as well. So I think there's definitely lines here for the blue version. I think it's the one guy, I can't remember his name right now, but I've seen him popping up with this list over and over again, and it's always very interesting to me. And I think it's very strong. And I've played some green too. Some of the most notable Underworld cards in green are, believe it or not, Salacious Crumb. I mean, having that heal and the ping over and over again for 1 cost is pretty solid. You're pinging, you're healing, you're pinging, you're healing. And then you have Maul, right? Oftentimes, I mean, green is the color that you ramp to, so anytime you can ramp to your Cad Bane is pretty solid. The green beaters at the end too, Reinforcement Walker if you need it, Relentless, Devastator, those things like that. Obviously they're not Underworld, but typically when you get to that point in the game, you're not really worried about the pinging anyway. But the most notable green card is going to be Maul probably, and then obviously Data Vault gives you the opportunity to fill out your deck with more tricks and more events and things of that nature. And obviously the power of Data Vault comes in the redundancy of the cards. So this is where you start adding things like Syndicate Lackeys, OG Infant's Nest, things of that nature, all these things that are just ambushing Cloud Rider. Obviously they're all doing the same thing, so that redundancy, if you will, doesn't really make it too big of a difference, because they're all the cards are kind of doing what you need them to do. They're doing the same thing, so the extra cards really don't matter at that point. So I definitely think that we could see a little bit of a Data Vault version as well, if you will. I mean, obviously you're not getting that ping Tarkin Town, that huge tempo play, but you can get that incremental ping over time, and punch up if you're continuously ambushing can be really, really strong, where you just slowly build a board advantage. So let's talk about some flex and preferences. I go back and forth on Ruthless Raider. It's obviously very good for the control matchup, but oftentimes when you flip Cad and you play a Ruthless Raider, it can sometimes feel pretty underwhelming. Obviously, you're not getting the ping damage from Cad's ability at that point, and that's your whole turn. So you're not getting the leader or the unit. Like I said, it's very good in the control matchup because it dodges Fell and it dodges Takedown and things like that. And then obviously it's burn damage straight to the base if they remove it. Outside of that, IG 2000 is obviously a pretty solid card, even though it's understated in this deck, because it does do all that damage plus the ping damage. It gives you a body in space, which sometimes this deck can lack. I've always loved Bosk. I mean, sometimes I've wanted Bosk over Zuckuss in a lot of situations, because he's obviously a faster play than a Zuckuss can be without a 4-LOM on board. And then oftentimes, if you're starting to chain events with him, he can really help you clear boards and start to do a ton of damage. I think Surprise Strike is more or less a core card at this point, especially trying to end games. And then this last card, I think, is definitely on the rise with where the meta's at this point. I think Sabine will be around. Obviously, I think we all know Han 1 is going to be back, Spark of Rebellion Han. And then, I think people have started to talk about Rey again some more. And anytime you can know Good to Me Dead, any of those, I think, is going to be a very strong play for you while you help to control the rest of the board. Keeping those leader units down for 2 turns is going to be very, very solid. And at the cost of 2 is, again, just a very good play. Bazine, I would say, is a pretty core card as well. Again, I'm just kind of going off of some stats here and some of the meta. You can see the percentages down there. But these are some flexes and preferences that I think are pretty solid for this deck. Bazine is obviously insane with McClunky. You can constantly take your opponent's preferred card out of their hand over and over again. Cad Bane can often just shut the game down. I feel like not enough people will just capture 2 things and then use the ping to kill off the 3rd thing instead of capturing that 3rd thing. Like I said, I think it's just a lot better to be killing off that last unit than just capturing it. It doesn't really, there's obviously a downside if you capture that 3rd thing, but you can often kind of do the math to where you capture 2 things and use the ping from the Cad leader to finish off that last thing. And obviously card draw is always nice, and at the end of the game, if you're surprise striking for 10 or hot shotting for 9, that's pretty tough to come back from. But this guy can often just shut the game down, and going back to that Quinlan matchup, the Han Solo unit from Spark of the Rebellion just always ate this guy up, and it was always something that was an absolute issue because I don't know, it would just feel really bad to play a Cad, swallow up a board, and then immediately get it wiped out by Han. Nihil Marauder. I don't. I like this card, but there's often times where that one damage on defense feels so bad. So I like it in more of in a matchup where you're trying to really shove damage versus a control matchup, for instance, or one where there's not maybe going to be a ton of removal. Like I said, the one damage on the unit just feels really bad sometimes. The tried and true Crafty Smuggler. It's not something you see in the Weenie decks, which is I think why its percentage is dropped in terms of being kind of a core card. But anytime you get that 2/2 shielded going, it really helps trade into things. And oftentimes the play line is pretty clear to me when you ping something that's got 3 health, and then you just trade the shield into it, and you can kind of save that Tarkin down for later. And then really a preference of mine is Relentless Pursuit. I think there's often times where you flip Cad, you Relentless Pursuit something that costs 6, so you play a No Good to Be Dead, you play a Surprise Strike, you play a Boba, a Bazine, whatever you got to do at that point. But that's kind of where that 2-card flip turn comes into play, because Relentless Pursuit on your Cad leader can oftentimes just be a blowout in your favor. It's half your turn, you have 3 resources up to still do something, you give your leader a shield, and hopefully you're capturing maybe a new Anakin, you're capturing Spark of Rebellion, Obi-Wan, anything that costs 6, right, to really just blow out that turn and really kind of continue to keep that board stay in your advantage. So these are kind of some of the flex and preferences that I like, really with a tilt towards Relentless Pursuit, and I think No Good to Be Dead is more or less just going to be a core card at this point in this deck, regardless of the color you're playing it in. Some Fringe options and some sideboard options. Fennec, I think, is kind of our version of Spark of Rebellion Han. You're playing so many tricks and low-costed things up the curve, ambushing units that often don't stick around too terribly long, that you can really get this Fennec going. I don't think I'd ever 3 of it, but sometimes it can really come in handy, wiping a Luke off the board and not taking any damage back. I mean, I've wiped out Great Dragons with it before. Obviously you're taking damage back, but you gotta do what you gotta do sometimes. It can really punch up. It's a really good card against like Supreme Leader Snoke, because the on attack goes first, and then so you really only need 4 different things in your graveyard that have a different cost for it to wipe out a Snoke. Sidon, obviously very good against space decks. He's not really a unit you're ever wanting to play on the ground for a 2/2, but anytime that you can attach him to a ship and then ping it, it's kind of just a removal spell, honestly, in a way. I would say he's more of a sideboard option, or maybe a one-off if you're thinking you might run into some more space and then sideboard him in later. I'm not sure how relevant Jabba's going to be moving forward. Obviously, a lot of this deck, and you can see it in the bottom right, has some tricks that you definitely want to be finding and more or less drawing. I mean, he's a huge body. He's great to put a Hotshot Blaster on. He was kind of one of the premier cards that you would need against Quinlan, but I'm not so sure how much we're going to need him going forward. Syndicate Lackeys is one that I wouldn't say is as popular, but again, going back to where I think this meta is going to be shifting to, if we think about Rey, if we think about Han, Spark of Rebellion, they all have 6 health, which is obviously not enough for Lackeys, but if we can keep the board clean, we can cleanly trade into Han, Spark of Rebellion with that ping damage and stay on board against Rey with that ping damage. So I think Lackeys probably is on the rise a little bit. And then this next card, top right, we've not talked about it, but we've talked about the fact that Force Throw is such an oppressive card, and that's, I think, why we haven't seen this card, because it does take 2 cards out of your hand. Obviously, it can be very, very strong, but if that gets answered, then you're kind of on the back foot at that point. But anytime you can get an early Zuckuss or a Bosk or something like that out, it can be very, very strong and just completely lock down the game. I like Spacer enough. It's just been around forever. I think it's pretty solid against the Sabine matchup potentially if they go Space to start off and you play first. Because you can just exhaust their first play, ping it, and then start to think about target titling it at that point if you want to or not. Lurking Tie is a sideboard card more or less exclusively for control. We all know about Lurking Tie. I would say Devastator is also kind of a control-y type card. I mean, obviously it can be answered at that point in the game, but it in conjunction with Sneak Attack can just destroy. If you don't answer that, obviously the game just kind of ends with this deck, because up until that point, you've probably controlled the game, you've probably gotten damage on base, and if you can Sneak Attack 13 damage to base, you're probably winning at that point. Bamboozle is a card that I think is just it should be in any yellow deck. Doesn't matter if it's ability or heroism. It's just that good of a card against pilots and whatnot. So I think it should be in the 60 or 60 plus, depending on the deck that you're playing. But obviously, if you're playing blue, it goes very well with Anakin. But being able to immediately take off your Boba Fett, JTL leaders, your Kazudas, things of that nature. And again, this is a deck that's predominantly playing cunning cards anyway, so you're almost always able to pitch that extra card and not have to worry about the added aspect penalty. Again, goes great with Jabba if you're trying to do trick stuff and draw it. And then again, goes really well with Anakin if you're playing a blue variant. But again, stocks up on that too, because we don't have to worry about Force Throw shredding our hand after discarding 2 cards. Those are some cards that I think should definitely be in consideration as we move forward. Specifically, Lackeys, Bamboozle, and I think that there's probably a world in which we can go back to it now. There are 2 of them slant as well. And then I just wanted to talk about some of the cards that we have seen during spoiler season that I think make a fair amount of sense in the Cad Bane realm here. So SEC, it just means more. I'm a big South Carolina football fan, and we play in the SEC, so that's just kind of a pun and a joke that I just put up there. Laugh if you want to, or don't. The first card is thematically Cad Bane in a Cad Bane deck. Obviously, it only works if you're really playing the blue variant of it. Anytime you can flip your Cad Bane leader, and we plot this guy out, we ping for 2, and then we kill something that has 2 or less remaining HP. I think that can be potentially very, very strong. Obviously, this deck suffers with card draw. It makes resourcing easier, which is something I've always advocated for. I think anytime you can make your resourcing decisions easier, I think that's always going to be something that's pretty solid that I think is often not thought about enough. It's not, I wouldn't say on par stats, 4-5. You're never really going to want to play this guy straight up. Obviously, if we get the ping damage, that makes it better. So he's probably better in this deck than any other deck. But, again, I think that there is added benefit to the whole plot mechanic. You could plot and then you could play McClunky on something, right? With that 1 resource up. A card that we didn't talk about, Shoot First, I think is pretty solid in conjunction with pings. So there's often times where you can kind of get a 2 damage differential with Shoot First. So that's something you could do. McClunky, there's ways that you can play around this and make this worth your while, I think. A card that they just recently released is Raiden Boss. Not the biggest fan of this card. I just think the stats on it are pretty rough. But I think there's probably a world where maybe it can live in the Weenie version of Cad. You suit this guy up with a Maul's lightsaber or a hotshot or a surprise strike in that version. It can be really, really tough to deal with if your opponent's not immediately answering it. But for me, I just think it's a little too slow. But I do see a world in which this guy is just kind of a beater and an ender for a Cad Weenie aggro version, or any sort of red villain aggro. I think there's a world for Hondo. He's got that perfect cost for the Cad flip with plot. Obviously, its stats again aren't particularly on rate, but notably it does have that underworld tag. So we flip our Cad leader out. We ping for 2. We action cheat, which again I think is another added bonus of this plot. As you action cheat, you get back to having initiative sooner, which is I think something you really want to have as Cad going into these later stages of the game, trying to end it before we get to super late game. Making Cad hit for 5 at that point can be pretty strong. That changes the math on things. It changes the breakpoints on things. Giving him that extra raid, and obviously a 6/5 body is, stats that you have to worry about. So, again, the action cheating, the card economy, the raid, the underworld. I think there's a world in which he can maybe at least be a 1 or 2 of. I don't know that I would ever go 3 of here because again, these plot cards, I don't think you're ever wanting to just play on curve. I think you're definitely wanting to plot them out. Punishing 1, I actually think is maybe one of the better ones that we've seen so far for this deck. I think if we kind of start thinking about the early turns of McClunky, IG 2000, and Punishing 1, that's just a ton of incremental pinging damage that can be really, really impressive. Part of me thinks that this card is maybe a little anti-synergistic with Cad, because oftentimes we're not wanting to leave things around that are damaged. But, the on-attack can kind of change the math on things again with this guy, if he sticks around, right? We get the win played, so you do 1 damage, and then you do 1 damage from the ping that they get to choose. But then if he sticks around, you can on-attack and basically punch up with this guy for, a pretty solid amount, at least 4 at that point, and then if there's anything else that's got damage on it. And in a deck that kind of struggles against space sometimes, I think this card is probably more of a core card than maybe the previous 3 that we've been talking about on this slide here. But I like Punishing 1. I think it's got a good shot to be a pretty solid card in this deck. And I'm pretty excited about these last 2 cards. We'll talk about Grand Admiral Thrawn first. I think he really helps shore up not only Cad's control matchup, but any control matchup in these colors. Obviously, we have the capture mechanic. 7 cost is pretty notable because typically, we flip Cad, we do Cad things, and the board is pretty clear. And it really makes this when played, choose what you want to do kind of hard, because if we don't capture something, then this is an 8/7 stats that is slamming down your door. And I just think it's a really good card in terms of keeping that board clear. Obviously, it does a lot of the same things that the Cad Bane unit does, but there's instances where that Cad Bane unit comes down and we're only capturing 1 thing anyway, and we're worried about the entire board going back to them. It's got more power too, which is notable, and then just the ability to ready if nothing gets captured. If you play this into an empty board, which is something that is often the case with Cad Bane, it can be really, really, really strong. And then if they do answer it, well, then we just shove something under our Cad leader or our Zuckus or whatever. And oftentimes too, playing those 2 cards on that Cad flip, we have a Weenie that we can give over to our opponent. So I think actually I'm mixing that up with the new Lando card. Anyway, but I think that this card could be really, really strong in this the 60 sideboard or core. And like I said, it does the same thing that Cad Bane more or less does, the unit card, but I think the single target of it and just the fact that it really does put a lot of stress on your opponent after what was hopefully a very stressful flip turn for them to begin with. And then this arrest card, I really, really, really like the idea of this card, especially if we think about Unrefusable Offer, which is a very, very solid card that I think some CAD lists were starting to run to help shore up control as well. But previously, the only way we could capture things if we had units out. But now we have this arrest card, which reads to me, if we have Unrefusable Offer, I pay 4, I take your thing, I swing with your thing, and it gets removed from the board, which to me is just a bonkers combination. Oftentimes, Unrefusable Offer would be out there. You would put it on like an Avenger or something that was huge. You would play the CAD leader, or not CAD leader, the CAD unit, and then the Avenger would be on your side, and then it would get defeated. But that requires you to have a unit. It costs way more. Obviously, there's that relentless pursuit angle, but again, that also requires a unit. But everybody has a base, so this is a 2 cost. You do that, right? And then even outside of that is kind of just a remove a unit from the board. You can take anything that's got upgrades on it. You can take Sentinels. You can take whatever you want, remove them from the board, and continue to shove damage. You can continue to do whatever you were doing, and it only costs 2. So I think this card is extremely good. I think it just helps continue to pressure like crazy in a deck that already makes the most of this capture mechanic that's been around for a while. I really like the prospects of this card, especially with Unrefusable Offer, in a world where, again, we're able to play multiple cards per turn now that Forcer is gone, in a world where we still need to worry about control against this deck. I think there's definitely a really good play line there for those control matchups. So that's kind of some ramblings and mumblings about Cad Bane. This is kind of a one take here. We're not really editing this, so I hope you all enjoyed it. Definitely willing to chat about Cad Bane. I think he's a great leader. Again, the Swan song. So I'm definitely interested in getting some of these new cards, trying to find a way to fit them into my deck, my Cad Bane deck going forward, and making the most out of Cad before he rotates on out. So thank you all, and we'll talk to you next time.